Hi, and welcome to the first episode of About the Authors TV Science Fiction Edition. I'm your host, Jake Brown. Andy Weir has been writing the forefront of millennium science fiction since the groundbreaking debut of his novel The Martian. As a free serial on his website before becoming a bestseller on Kindle's ebook list, eventually it rocketed all the way to number 2 on the New York Times bestseller list. He next became a worldwide household name in 2016 when Matt Damon and director Ridley Scott brought botanist-astronaut Mark Watney to life on the silver screen in the blockbuster film The Martian, even earning Matt Damon his first Best Actor Oscar in the process. Following its massive success up with otherworldly originals like Artemis, currently in film production, and Project Hail Mary most recently, Weir has maintained a prolific creative output as well across his original Casey and Andy and Cheshire Cross It comic book series. He joins us today to talk about all of it. Andy, thank you so much for taking out time to be with us. Let's take viewers back to the beginning, if we will, where I understand, among other genres, you grew up not surprisingly reading classic science fiction authors like Arthur C. Clarke and Isaac Asimov.
And so I grew up reading those. The original ones. Some of the authors were my holy trinity are Heinlein, Asimov, and Clarke. Okay, so those are the ones I really like. The ones that, some of my favorite books are, let's see, on Heinlein, we got Tunnel in the Sky, Starman Jones, Starship Troopers, the book. I didn't like the movie very much. And I also liked Farmer in the Sky. I think it was called Farmer in the Sky. Anyway, Asimov, of course, there's the, I love all the robot related stuff. I actually like the Caves of Steel saga more than Foundation. But that's just a personal preference. And then for Arthur C. Clarke, actually, if I had to pick one that I like the best, I would say Rama. Just the first one. I didn't really like the subsequent ones. But anyway, so those are some of the books I grew up reading. I read an awful lot of Heinlein back then. So this is when I'm like, a tween and then on into my teenage years. So despite the fact that this was like the mid 80s, I was reading baby boomer era science fiction.
So it's fair to say those authors show up as derivative influences in your writing style today.
Absolutely. Those authors and those books defined what science fiction is for me. And so I guess that's one of the reasons I appear to have a unique voice, is because I have what is effectively a really old voice that nobody uses anymore. The style of science fiction storytelling that, in my opinion, was often very aspirational and hopeful, and that these are futures that you would like to live in. And the characters had problems, often life and death problems, and often they would have like serious issues, or there'd be massive political tumultuous things going on like Mars or the moon, like in The Moon is a Harsh Mistress or Red Planet. But it was still a future that was really neat and something that you would want to live in. And I kind of took that with me. I honestly believe that the future is almost always better than the past. There's almost no point in the future. Yeah, let me put it this way. If I said, okay, you got to go back in time and live the rest of your life. Do you want to go 100 years ago, 200 years ago, or 300 years ago? You'd first say like, well, can I do 100 years ago, right? And then failing that, you'd say like, well, I guess I do 100 years ago because it's better than the others. Humanity always gets better. And I think that's borne out by our history. In the short term, maybe it doesn't seem that way, but in the long term, it's definitely true. I sure love not having typhoid fever, and I have never seen a no colored sign anywhere in my life, not in person, right? Only in old photos. So just life gets better. And so that sort of aspirational, the future is awesome, let's get there kind of science fiction is what I grew up reading. And so that's kind of what I write.
On the other end of the spectrum, given that you went on to write comics before actually becoming a published novelist, what kind of comic books did you read as a kid?
I'm a Marvel man, I'll have you know. So really, the X-Men was the main thing that I read when I was growing up. I loved that. And what else did I get? I was just really all about the X-Men, but there were like 700 different comic series. Oh, and the Brian Bendis Spider-Man reboot, the Ultimate Spider-Man. I think that was the first of the Ultimate reboots. And I really like that. It was the only time I've ever seen just this entire massive series of comics that were all written by the same person and drawn by the same person. So the art style never even changed. It was very consistent. It was really fun to read. And then all of the Ultimates, actually, I kind of got into all the Ultimates. It was a nice So I guess that's early 2000s, really. But it was nice to get into those because you didn't need to know a million years of backstory. Start fresh, work from there. Um, yeah, although I did have all my life, even as a little kid, I always had a soft spot for Aquaman. So there's uh, my one DC guy is Aquaman. And of course, I like Batman. I, you know, I have a heart, don't I? But I always liked Aquaman, and I'll have no, I'll hear nothing bad about him.
Not surprisingly, you discovered quite a talent for computer programming early on in your teens, and by 15 were already working professionally as a programmer for Sandia National Laboratories. And then by your late teens and early 20s, you were working for companies like AOL, Palm, and Blizzard as a programmer and video game designer. Along with Warcraft 2, what were some of the coolest projects you worked on there? And anything you picked up from those years on the tech side, so to speak, that filtered into your novel writing later on?
Well, I mean, everybody's got a profession, right? And software engineering was mine. And yeah, I did get an early start. I started at 15. I was working for a national lab. That makes me sound like some sort of wunderkind, but really it was just like I was a gopher. I wasn't like, oh, no one in the world can do what this guy can. No, I was just sort of a, cheap labor. But uh, it's interesting. Like, yeah, of course. So I know a lot about computers, but I try not to make my stories be too heavily about computers because that's kind of a boring topic for me. It was, it's like the world I lived in for a long time. So it's not that interesting to me. Space is interesting to me. And so actually, that time I spent at the National Lab, Sandia National Labs in Livermore, was actually very useful for me. Not so much with the technical stuff, but with the culture of working at a major federal research institution. Like, so just the science culture there, the culture, just kind of how things worked, how people interacted, what the researchers were like, what the administrators were like, just being able to see all that in action. I used that as a model for how NASA's internals worked in the Martian. And people at NASA told me that it's spot on. So I apparently it mapped over pretty well. As for the science stuff, that just came from my passions and my hobbies. I go out of my way to look that stuff up and learn about it. Everybody's knowledgeable in their hobbies, right? If you're a
Yeah.
football fan, you can name off all the players and all the teams and who won the Super Bowl in 1974. Probably the Steelers, right? I'm not sure, but you can do all that stuff. And well, so my hobby is space dork stuff. So that's what I'm knowledgeable in.
During the first decade of the millennium, you made an avant-garde move like so many of your peers of first beginning to publish your stories on your website, comics to begin with in your case. And we understand you actually based some of the characters in Casey and Andy on yourself and your friends, and had another Cheshire Crossing, where you successfully blended Peter Pan, the Wizard of Oz, Mary Poppins, and Alice in Wonderland, among others. Please tell us about that.
That was a hobby that I did. Yeah, I made comics and I posted them to my website, and that's how I accumulated my original reader base. Originally, my comic, it was called Casey and Andy, and the two main characters were Casey and Andy, and they were based on myself and my friend Casey. And in the comic, they're mad scientists who can make time machines, spaceships, whatever you want. And Andy was dating Satan, literally. Satan was a woman. Casey's girlfriend was always trying to kill Andy. I mean, it was really over the top. They would frequently die. The main characters would often be absolutely dead, and then they'd be fine like one panel later with no explanation as to how. And it was just a very silly web comic. I got a decent following out of it. A lot of people liked it a lot. I kind of ran out of steam on it, so I ended it with a big story arc and everything. And yeah, and then I rolled into another comic I made called Cheshire Crossing, which was a crossover comic with Alice from Alice in Wonderland, Dorothy from Peter Pan, and Dorothy from The Wizard of Oz, and Wendy from Peter Pan. These three girls, now teenagers in the year 1910, are brought together by Ernest Rutherford, who's a Nobel laureate scientist, and he wants to study how it is that they can transport themselves to other planes and how they have these superpowers. And the girls all end up going to each other's worlds and having adventures, and there's a romance plot between Captain Hook and the Wicked Witch of the West. It's all in good fun. Later on, after I made that and animated, drew it myself. Also, I'm a terrible artist, and so later on, after I got popular for the Martian and all these things, Sarah Anderson, a company had Sarah Anderson, who people may know from Sarah's Scribbles. She's a very talented author. Well, she is a talented author, but also a very talented artist, which is what I meant to say. And she redid all of the art on it, and we released it as a trade paperback, and it's great. It was a lot of fun.
We'd love to ask you about a short story called The Egg, which is a true original, and so resonated with the reading public and your creative brethren that it's since been turned into a one-act play, countless YouTube videos, and even became the conceptual basis for Logic's Everybody album.
I like trying to come up with systems, like how things work and interact with each other. I like trying to come up with like fictional biospheres or what have you. Like when I was young, younger, in my teens, my friends and I made a science fiction based role playing game, and so it was fun to come up with the biospheres of these other planets. Like, okay, how does life work on this world and that world? Um, for the egg, what I was trying to do was I was trying to come up with a system for the afterlife that made it absolutely 100% fair. Like that that you paid exactly the right amount of suffering or experienced exactly the right amount of joy based on the actions you took in your life. And I said, well, how do you do that? I'm like, well, maybe you could be forced to experience the emotions that someone else experienced. And I'm like, well, then, like, you know what if you did it by mistake? What if it was, and how does God decide what you are and aren't responsible for, and so on? And so I just said, like, well, in the end, if you live every human life one at a time, then it's fair. You've experienced everything. And so then I'm like, well, why would that system be in place? And I'm like, oh, okay, this is how, this is the fetal development of some sort of cosmic being. And then I'm like, okay, so God is your parent and the whole universe is an egg. And that concept, I came up with it in an evening, and I took me about 40 minutes to write the first draft. I did an editing pass and posted it, and I didn't really look back. But then it just got really, really popular, which is pretty cool. And a lot of people, I get a disturbingly large number of emails from people who say, like, oh, I believe this is true. And I'm like, no, I'm not going to be your cult leader. I don't believe this is true. It's a story I wrote. I also don't think there's a guy stranded on Mars. It's just a story.
That's the perfect gateway to blast off into the worldwide phenomenon known as the Martian. To begin, do you remember a specific moment where the overarching plot first hits you? An astronaut stranded on Mars who has to survive until rescued. While back at Earth, they're not sure they can pull it off.
I don't get sudden bursts of inspiration like that. It's always like a slow process where I build it up. But like I said, I like trying to come up with systems and how things interact. And so I was trying to, just for fun, because this is the sort of dorky stuff I do, I was trying to think of how do we do a crewed mission to Mars? How do we put humans on Mars and return them safely to the Earth, right? And so I thought, okay, we got to get them there. They got to spend some time there. They got to come home. And during all this, we need to be as safe as possible. They need to have these backup systems to the backup systems. How do we get them there efficiently? All this stuff like that. So it started off with me basically just designing a Mars mission. Not not for a story or anything. Just, okay, how do we do this? How do we do that? And so I was working on it, and then I said, okay, once what are the things that can go wrong, and then how do we ensure that that doesn't kill the crew, or that's not maybe not even an abort situation. How do we make that work? And then I started to think, okay, what if this goes wrong? Okay, well, they'll have a backup thingy for that. What if this goes wrong? Well, there's backups for that. What if these two things both break? Aha, well, then they would have to do this thing, but they'd be okay. And the increasingly desperate things the crew would have to do to survive as the situations get more dire, I was like, this is kind of interesting. And so I thought, well, what if I had just one guy there? And I'm like, well, there's no reason that they would send one guy there. I'm like, well, what if they left because they thought he was dead? And I'm like, okay, now there's something I can work with, because there's really no way to get him back conveniently, especially if they took the ship home. And then that's where my premise came from. And then I was like, okay, all these things, I have this entire Mars mission designed. And now I've said, and now with my design that was not prepared for a person stranded alone. Now what happens? And there was just so much interesting stuff. I'm like, all right, off we go.
Please tell viewers when astronaut Mark Watney first joined the mission, so to speak.
I hate giving characters names. It's one of the toughest parts for me. I people expect protagonist names to have some sort of deep meaning or whatever, but I just always go like, oh God, I don't care. Just give me a name. And so I named him Mark simply because Mark is an ancient name that it goes back to you're being named after the Roman god Mars. So Mark means you're, of Mars. So that's a little direct, but whatever. I went for Mark. Also, I wanted like an everyman name. He's an everyman guy. He's not some like unattainable astronaut guy that you can never. He's a guy that you'd have a beer with. He's a guy who kind of you figure might fix your car, you know. And so I didn't want him to have a name like, Reginald. I wanted him to be like, Ted, So I went for Mark. And then for his last name, at the time I started writing it, I started writing it in 2009. And at the time, I was living in Boston, and I'm a big Red Sox fan. So I watched every Red Sox game. I always have it on TV in the evening. And I was writing, and I'm like, I need a last name for this guy. And at that moment, it switched to the sideline reporter for the Red Sox, who at the time was Heidi Watney. So because Heidi Watney's name is Watney, I'm like, Watney, I like that. That's a nice, I like that. That name works.
Readers and moviegoers around the world didn't just fall in love with The Martian for Mark Watney, but also for his extremely lovable and memorable supporting cast of characters in space and down on Earth at NASA. How did you so authentically capture the kind of dialogue they'd have back and forth, for instance in Mission Control, and beyond in this very unique world of personalities that populate the book?
You have to put yourself into the mind of your characters. But I think mostly it's based on, I've seen a million documentaries about space travel, the Apollo program, the STS program, everything, So I've seen a lot of how astronauts talk to each other and how they talk to the ground and stuff. So I have a lot of experience with that. Mark Watney, of course, had a distinct voice in my mind, and he's just my personality, but he's like my own idealized version of me. He's like what I wish I were. He's all of the qualities about myself that I like my smart ass sense of humor, but he's better at it in every way. He's smarter than I am. He's funnier than I am. And then he doesn't have any of my downsides. He doesn't have my various neuroses, phobias, and all my other many, many flaws. And so that's where Mark's personality comes from. The scientific-minded folks at NASA, they really are based on the researchers that I worked with a lot in my days at Sandia Labs. And so that is how folks talked. And then also just there's something really enjoyable about watching people who are very good at their job do their job. And so I really wanted to hit the reader with these people who deeply understand the subject material they're talking about, just whipping the conversation back and forth. And just the real trick, of course, was expositioning everything so that the reader could understand it too. They feel like, hey, I'm one of those smart guys too, And so that was kind of the balance. That was the tricky bit, but it came out okay. Venkat, in the book, he's Venkat. In the movie, he's Vincent. He was the main guy on Earth doing everything he could to save Watney. I liked him a lot. I also, for the hey, I'm in over my head kind of feel, I really liked Mindy Park, who was the kind of low-level satellite navigational engineer who ended up thrust into the conference room. Mindy is thrust into the conference room with all the bigwigs at NASA who are like 12 levels above her pay grade, and she comes into her own. I liked having Annie Montrose there, the idea of this director of communications who's just incredibly gruff and stuff with people. Probably my favorite character among all of them of the Earthside people would be Rich Purnell. He's just like this quiet, kind of socially awkward. Actually, he's supposed to be a little bit on the spectrum genius. I liked him. But as for if we're looking at all the characters other than Mark, my favorite character is Commander Lewis, She's everything a commander's supposed to be. She always makes rational decisions. She gets things done. She felt a lot of guilt, of course, about when she found out that she left Watney behind, but she made the right decision at the time, and then she did everything she could to save him.
To that end, would you pull the curtain back a bit on how you first began researching the planet of Mars, studying its conditions on the ground, and how an astronaut would actually survive there, and the science of how NASA lands on Mars? For instance, did you mostly stick to what's available technology-wise, or add any of your own extras? And of course, why did botany make sense?
Early on, I decided, okay, well, I mean, I decided all along he was going to be rescued. It's not going to be a tragedy, right? So I decided, okay, initially my thought was he would just wait until Ares 4 came. And in fact, when I first started writing it, my plan was for the entire book to be just him by himself surviving. He never contacts Earth. He gets to the Ares 4 landing site and is just there when they show up. And they're surprised, you know. But then as I wrote the story, so anyway, so that was my original plan. And that's where I came up with a lot of things. I was like, okay, well, the mission profile I set up, they can only do a mission about every 4 years. So he'd have to be there for years and years. How do I explain that? You know, how he can't possibly have enough food. I'm like, well, he could grow food, you know. So let's say he grows food, and I'm like, well, also Ares 4 is going to be somewhere far away, and so, well, that's a problem he's going to have to solve. He's going to have to figure out how to get there. And so those were concepts I came up with when I first thought he was going to be completely by himself. Then as time went by, as I started writing things, I'm like, it is impossible for NASA not to find out that he's alive. You know, he's doing stuff, and surely they're going to look at the site. You know, they have satellites, they can see things to a resolution of, 1 foot with today's technology, probably better with 2035-ish technology. So they would definitely find out. And so how do I keep, I can't keep them from finding out. So they're going to find out. So that's going to affect things. And then I thought, like, well, also Mark should realize that his absolute highest odds of survival come from contacting NASA, finding any way you can. And if I'm going to have this guy solving every problem under the sun, it's going to be really unlikely that he can't fix a radio, right? And so I said, like, well, the radio was actually, critical parts were carried off in the storm. And I'm like, but that's not the only radio on Mars. So the idea of Pathfinder and all of that. So I pretty quickly abandoned the idea of no one ever knowing that he was still alive. But then it became this, the narrative where it's first person from him and then third person for the Earth side scenes. And then they come together and then the rescue and all that stuff. But but I liked the ideas that I'd come up with, where I'm like, okay, I want him to have to be there for a long time, long enough that he has to literally like make his own food, and that he's going to need to go on a big long journey, on an overland trip across Mars and have adventures. And so all that kind of played well into itself. It's like, okay, well, they can't land at his location and pick him up, but he can go to the Ares 4 lander. And I actually had a lot of people would email me and say, like, hey, I really like your book. I didn't really follow all the science, but that's okay. I just kind of like skimmed the things that talked about science too heavily and then got back to the story. And I was like, at first I was like, hey, bite me. I wrote, it took me a long time to write this. It should take you a long time to read it. But then I thought, like, well, it's to have a reader implicitly trust you, the writer, enough to just say, yeah, all this is going to be accurate. Like, I'm sure this is all 100% correct. I'm going to move on. To have that level of trust built up with your reader, and just to have their suspension of disbelief so rock solid at that point, that's you can't buy that. That's great. So if they're willing to skip over paragraphs because they're just so bought into the scenario that they don't even need them, then I'm like, okay, that's great.
Please share anything you found most fascinating to play with on the page, having to do with spaceflight, orbital mechanics, and in respect to the awesome rescue, which seems so real in the book and film, on how you would actually attempt something like that. I understand you actually plotted out the whole course before you even wrote it in the book. Is that right?
All the technology in the entire story was stuff that either existed already or was very heavily speculated on and being worked on by scientists. I mean, so the idea of the oxygenator that just uses energy to turn carbon dioxide into carbon and oxygen. I mean, now I think there's the MOXIE, right, which is on landing on Mars in a couple of weeks as of the time that we're recording this. And so that's a real technology that people have been working on for quite a while. Hermes is powered by ion engines, Vasimir drives specifically. That's another real technology, but it's nowhere near as efficient as the versions in the story. They're much more powerful, much larger scale, but it's within reach technologically. Also, Hermes is powered by a nuclear reactor, which, believe it or not, we have had nuclear reactors in space before. The Soviets and the Americans have both put small reactors in space, and then brought them back. But yeah, so you can have a nuclear reactor in space; they will work. And then there are a couple of hand wavy things I did, like kind of the magic radiation proofing that the HAB canvas had. Why? I don't know. No such material exists. However, there was a study done by some folks who I guess had an excess of free time. These are real scientists, and they studied the estimated radiation dose for each member of the crew of the Ares 3 mission, including things like what the fact that in the period that it takes place happens to be a solar minimum. And they accounted for everything, and they came up with, these are the odds of, for each crew member, of dying earlier than they normally would have of cancer caused by the radiation they got. And the worst off was actually Johansson, had about a 2% chance. So even if they'd had no radiation shielding at all, everybody would have been fine. And what's funny is Mark Watney came out the best. He had the lowest radiation dosage because while the rest of the crew was out in space during that whole time, Watney was on Mars, so half of the universe was shielded from him by the planet Mars itself. So he had a much lower dose of radiation than the rest of them. And the reason Johansson had such a bad time of it, or would have the highest odds of dying, is first off, she's young. So the younger you are, the higher your odds are of developing cancer down the line from a radiation dose now. And second off, she's a woman, and they don't know why, but women are more susceptible to cancer from radiation. A guy on the ground named Rich Purnell works out a means by which Hermes could go back to Mars from its current course. And it involves using Earth as a slingshot and then going out, and they'll pass by Mars with a hyperbolic trajectory. They're not going to be able to go into orbit, and then they'll come back to Earth. And so I actually plotted out that course. The way I did it was well, first I went online and said, so Hermes is a spacecraft that is propelled by ion propulsion, which is real technology. And it's basically got a very small amount of acceleration, but it's got it going all the time. And so it's always thrusting just very, very little. And so I said, well, how do you even do the math on calculating orbital trajectories with something like that? How does NASA do it? And I found out they cheat. They do it by simulation, just massive, just really, really small time slices simulation. So I'm like, well, I can do that. So I wrote software to do the simulations for me. And I wrote software to let me try to plot courses and say, okay, at this point, change your angle to this and always be thrusting this way for a while and so on. And I adjusted and adjusted and adjusted until I found a sequence, a path, a set of maneuvers that would actually allow them to get all the way back to Mars. Well, first I plotted out their original course, then I plotted out their adjusted course because they left about 25 days earlier than they planned to, and then I plotted out the Rich Purnell maneuver. And yeah, that was a huge amount of work. And then that's also ultimately what led me to fix the date that it took place, because I had to know where Earth and Mars are at those times. And I'm like, okay, then this launch, Earth and Mars have to be this many degrees apart from, from the sun to be, for this to work at the initial launch window. And then, so when are those launch windows? And it's like, so every two years and a month or two, the Sidonic period of Earth and Mars. I'm like, okay, it can be any of these. But for a plot point, I needed them to be on Mars. Their original plan was to be on Mars on Thanksgiving Day of that year. So I'm like, okay, which ones of these end up with this day falling, with Thanksgiving falling within these 31 days? And it ended up being like, oh, only this one window will do. And so that's why I end up, okay, now I know the exact launch window and everything. So I ended up with a spreadsheet where I knew exactly what date, real world date, each sol was, and so on.
It's
So
fascinating.
way the hell more research than was necessary. One fun thing that happened was on the day that Mark was calling them with Pathfinder, on the day when he first made contact with them on Pathfinder, um, turned out to be February 14th. It was Valentine's Day. And I was thinking about making some sort of joke. It's like, all these guys, all these like researchers and stuff like that, all these like science dorks, like they're at work on Valentine's Day. And it's like, oh, sorry, this must be really disappointing to your girlfriends. Oh, that's right, you don't have any, or something like that, right? But it would have just seemed so out of left field to the reader. It's like the reader would have gone like, why the hell did he randomly decide that this would be Valentine's Day? What the, so I just didn't do it. It's one of those cases where truth is stranger than fiction, and so I had to leave it out because it would have been weird.
This book had quite a cool and unusual path toward that release that included you initially releasing it for free on your website, which by then had attracted quite a following of readers. And then you actually published it at fans' request on Amazon Kindle before Crown Publishing Group finally acquired the rights and then sent it shooting up the New York Times bestseller chart. That all had to be quite surreal.
I wrote the story for fun as a serial, and I was posting it to my website. It took me about 3 years, started in 2009, finished around 2012. And yeah, I posted it a chapter at a time to my website. I had a regular reading list of maybe 3,000 people, and they would send me feedback, and they were dorks. So they'd send me all the science mistakes I had. So I'd correct the science mistakes. It was nice. I had like 3,000 fact checkers. Then I eventually finished it, and I said, okay, I'm going to move on to writing other stuff. And a lot of people started emailing me saying, hey, I love The Martian, but I hate your website, which is fair. It was just like black text on a white background, blue hyperlinks here and there. It was just like the Soviet tractor factory equivalent of a website, right? And so they said, can you make it something I can load onto my e-reader? I'm like, okay. So I figured out how to do that. I put it up on my website as an EPUB and a MOBI format. Those are two of the major e-reader formats. This was before all e-readers could handle PDFs. So I said, there you go. You can read it on my website, or you can download it and put it on your e-reader. Onward. And then I got other emails saying, hey, Andy, love your story, hate your site. I see that you have, The Martian's available for e-reader and stuff, but I'm not really technically savvy, and I don't know how to download a thing from the internet and put it on my e-reader. Can you just put it up so I can just get it through the normal system? I'm like, okay. So I went to Amazon Kindle Direct Publishing, and I posted it there. It's pretty straightforward. They just you get to set the price at whatever you want, but with a minimum of 99 cents. So I set it to 99 cents, and meaning that I was pulling down a cool 35 cents or so per copy. Yeah, big money. And then they hang on to it for a day to make sure you're not posting goat porn, and then they make it available. And then so I said, all right, everybody, here it is. It's available on Kindle. You got to pay $1 for it, basically. I had to charge. You're not allowed to give stuff away for free, so you can either read it for free on my website, or you can download the e-reader versions for free from my website, or you can pay $1 to have Amazon put it on your Kindle for you. And people paid the $1. There was a lot of reasons I think people bought it. First off, people are willing to pay $1 to avoid hassles, especially if they already have the whole payment system set up. It's like, click this button, you lose $1 and you get the book, and you don't have to worry about figuring out how to sideload. Okay, so a lot of people did that. Also, throughout this whole process, a lot of my readers, my 3,000 regular readers, they were like, hey, I want to donate. A lot of people have donate buttons, and I'm like, I'm a software engineer. I got a 6-figure salary. I'm good. I don't need money. If you want to donate to cancer research, please. I'm good. And so when the opportunity came out for them to give me money as they saw it, they're like, oh, I will. So they bought copies of the ebook, even though they'd already read it. And they left, and everybody, it got really good reviews. Pretty soon it got up into, I mean, it was selling very well. Pretty soon it got up into the top 10 of sci-fi, and then the top 10 of all Kindle, and it crept onto the top 10 of Amazon list. And then, so it was doing really well. And around that time, I got approached by an agent, a literary agent. Now, in my 20s, I had taken a stab at being a full-time author, and I could not get any traction. I wrote an entire book. It's not The Martian. You've never heard of it, but couldn't get any traction, couldn't get a literary agent. Now I had one knocking on my door. And I'm like, sure, you can be my agent. He's like, great. And then like shortly after that, and the agent said, like, I'm going to see what the big publishing houses have to say about it. They might be interested. And then around that time, 20th Century Fox said, hey, we want the film rights to The Martian. And I'm like, talk to my agent. And my brand new agent said, well, I have a film agent colleague at CAA who will deal with that. So now I had a film agent. I have people now. And so the film agent was working out the deal with Fox, while my literary agent was working out a deal with Random House. And those two deals came together 4 days apart. And so meanwhile, at this time, I'm still a software engineer. I'm going to work in my cubicle, fixing bugs, taking calls about my movie deal, back to fixing bugs. And so it was a very surreal time. I ended up taking a day off that week just because I was so stressed. I just needed to lie down. But everything came through. And well, you know what happened after that. Once the book came out, it went to the New York Times bestseller list. It got up to number 2. Didn't quite get up to number 1 when it first came out because Gone Girl was in theaters. So the book Gone Girl was selling better. Freaking Gillian Flynn. But anyway, it got up to number 2, and the good sales and stuff like that, I'm sure, was part of why Fox greenlighted the movie.
How head-spinning was that roller coaster track to success for you? Especially when you got word that Ridley Scott and Matt Damon were developing it into a film. That had to blow you away. How much input were you given from the studio and scriptwriters during the making of the film?
On the movie side, all sorts of interesting things were going on. They got Drew Goddard to write and direct, and then Drew left to go direct a Spider-Man movie, but he still wrote it. And so they got Ridley Scott to direct, and then Matt Damon signed on to play the lead, and then it started really snowballing. It was amazing. It was just awesome. I mean, I'm like, wow, I made that up, and now here it is. So Matt Damon had signed on long before I got the first draft of the script. So I had already kind of like come to grips with that. The first draft of the script, I read it. It's a very direct telling of the story. Now, he had to cut some stuff out. It was written by Drew Goddard. He had to cut some stuff out because otherwise it'd be a 6-hour movie. But what he cut out is the stuff that I would have cut out if it had been up to me. As for what did I have to do with the production, my main job was to cash the check. I mean, that was it. They didn't have to involve me in any way. They chose to involve me in a few places, mostly for technical questions. So I served as sort of a science advisor in a way, but people like Drew Goddard and Ridley Scott definitely don't need my creative input.
What was that moment like you first saw it all come to life on the big screen?
I cried. I mean, just right there at the beginning, it starts in on this long shot of Mars, and then the title comes up, and I'm like, holy crap, that was amazing. They were all so jazzed.
Please introduce viewers to the already mythic among fans, Zek. And is there a chance that this novel might actually reach readers one day?
So I worked on Zek for about a year. After The Martian, people were in the mood to just sign me for whatever I was working on. And so I was working on, I was like, oh, my next story, it's awesome. It's this huge science fiction epic. It's more soft sci-fi. There's aliens, there's faster than light travel, there's telepathy, there's all this amazing stuff. And in my mind, it was going to be the coolest thing ever. And Random House was like, sure, write it. And so I put about a year of work into it. I wrote 70,000 words. For reference, The Martian is about 100,000 words. At that point, I realized, oh dear, this sucks. It's not working at all. The plot is too deep and complicated. The characters aren't that interesting. The pacing is glacial. This is turning into some sort of giant tome that no one will want to read. And I can't figure out how to fix it. And it was a very stressful time for me. And eventually I said, I'm going to have to shelve this. This is not working at all. So I called my publisher, my editor, and I asked him, hey, man, So you know that thing I've been working on for like a year, and you paid me a bunch of money for it. How's about I throw that away entirely and work on a completely new story from scratch? And they said, yeah, all right. And the reason they said that is because they'd been reading it. And so they knew it sucked too.
What a brave lesson for authors, knowing when to table a manuscript when it isn't working. You next started on what became the epic Artemis after this. Was this actually a book you'd begun working on before The Martian had been released as a book or film? And what was your initial muse for the idea? A book set on the moon in the 2080s and 2090s.
For Artemis, I wanted to write a story about, I started off with the concept of what is humanity's first city that's not on Earth? Doesn't have to be the moon, just not on Earth. And I thought, like, well, there's basically three options. It could either be in orbit or on the moon or on Mars. And I said, well, in orbit's no good because there's no material to use there. You have to lift every gram of material that you're using, you have to put it up into orbit. But on the moon, if you put up some smelting facilities, you'd be able to make use of the resources on the moon. It's basically made of moon bases. It's aluminum and oxygen. It's in massive abundance on the surface. So you just need to smelt it, which takes a lot of energy, but we've got energy. Put a reactor there. That's my answer to everything. You need energy, reactor. And then so I thought, okay, the moon works or Mars works. Well, between them, which is better? And I said, well, the moon. It's obviously we're going to colonize the moon before we colonize Mars. In the same reason that, the British colonized Wales before they colonized North America. It's just that much closer and that much easier. And so I said, okay, so I want to tell a story about a city on the moon. Question number one, why is there a city on the moon? What possible reason do you have to put a city on the moon? And I decided, a lot of science fiction stories answer that by saying, oh, it's people going there for political freedom. They're oppressed. To which I say, if you can afford to build a city on the frickin' moon, you're not oppressed. You're very, very rich. You're doing fine. Okay, so my next thing was like, okay, maybe population pressure. And I'm like, what about the bottom of the ocean? What about Antarctica? What about orbit? What about big buildings that reach way high up into the sky? Earth is a very large place. It's going to take a long time for population pressure to drive people into other places. Okay, what about environmental catastrophe makes Earth unlivable or nearly unlivable? And I say, well, whatever you're going to build on the moon, you could just build that on Earth, right? A big hermetically sealed city will be able to survive whatever environmental problems are going on Earth, right? So I finally decided, all right, there has to be a for-profit reason why there's a city there. And I finally decided, okay, tourism. If the price to getting people to the moon is low enough that middle-class people could afford to do it as a once-in-a-lifetime trip, then there's a tourism industry. And where would people want to go on the moon? The Apollo 11 landing site. So I said, okay, Artemis is deliberately built right next to the Apollo 11 landing site, and they deal with tourism. People who want to enjoy a couple of weeks of low gravity or lunar landscapes, or look at the descent stage of the Eagle. So that's the premise. And I came up with the economy first. Then my next step was, okay, how did they build the city? How did they do this? Okay, they started with a smelter, then they got aluminum, then they built geodesic domes, one inside the other to have a double layer of thing, put a bunch of crushed lunar regolith in between the two domes to deal with radiation, because I'm actually going to pay attention to that this time. There's just an infinite amount of aluminum and oxygen to be had there. And so you do all this, you build these domes, they have these individual, things like that. I came up with the whole how they built the city and what it's like inside the city. Only then did I stop for a long time and go like, okay, that's neat. What the hell is going to happen there though? It's not enough. So I put a huge amount of effort into making the city, and then I had no idea for a story. So I had one idea for a story. I came up with an idea. What if this happens? And I told it to my editor, and it wasn't working. It wasn't that good, but I had this interesting tertiary character who I needed, like a kind of a criminal underground person who was the smuggling go-to person. And so I created Jazz to be that role, a completely tertiary character. And at the time I was like, I don't have enough women in this, so I'm going to make the smuggler a woman. And I want to use a country. Artemis is one of those places like America in the early 1800s. If you can afford to get there, you can live there. So it's very, very international. And I'm like, okay, so what's a country I haven't used yet? Saudi Arabia. All right, the smuggler's a Saudi woman. Done. And then that story wasn't working out too well. So I came up with a completely different story, a new story entirely. And I used elements from the first idea that worked. And one of them was that smuggler character. This time she was a little more prevalent, but still very much a secondary character. But she was still, in there. The second story didn't work out either, but I thought like, hey, that smuggler character is kind of interesting. I think I like her. What if I built a story around her? And then that's how I came up with the idea for the story that happens in Artemis. As for the name of the city, well, Artemis is the Greek goddess of the moon, and she's Apollo's twin sister. So it seems like an appropriate name for a lunar city. And NASA agrees because after my book came out, they named their program the Artemis program. Although they didn't name it after my book, they named it after the Greek goddess for the same reasons that I named my city after the Greek goddess.
Your most recent bestseller, Project Hail Mary, takes the lead character, middle school teacher turned astronaut Rylan Grace, on a mission 12 light years from Earth. Please take it from there and tell viewers more about your latest space-age page-turner.
The basic premise, without giving away too many spoilers, on Project Hail Mary is a man wakes up aboard a spacecraft with two dead crewmates. He's the only survivor. He doesn't know why he's there. He doesn't know what he's doing there. He doesn't know his own name. He has complete amnesia. And he does know that he's been in a coma for quite a while. And over time, memories start coming back to him, and he begins to realize that he is the sole survivor of a desperate mission to save Earth from an existential threat. So the fate of humanity is in his hands. The name of the ship he's on is the Hail Mary because it's a last desperate attempt to save humanity. And so his name is Grace. Hail Mary, full of grace. Ah. And Ryland, I just thought was kind of a cool name.
You also have several long-running serial novels and stories, including The Detectives, Bonnie Mackenzie, The Life Story of a Mermaid, your take on Sherlock Holmes' universe with Moriarty, and a nod to Doctor Who with the Romana Chronicles. Which have you most enjoyed writing in this medium?
The serial work, Bonnie Mackenzie is probably my most popular yet to be professionally published story. I kind of ran out of steam on that, and it's a fantasy really more than anything else. And so once I ended up as a sci-fi author, I've been doing just sci-fi. I may revisit it sometime, but yeah, there's something about the serial writing form that I think it's kind of gone away. Like, but serial stories is how the original Sherlock Holmes stories were written. You had to, if you wanted to know, I mean, it was like Game of Thrones to people back then. It was like, people would aggressively go out and buy the next issue of the Strand magazine so they could find out what would happen next in this. It would take many, many issues to get through one Sherlock Holmes adventure. So yeah, and it was what people talked about, over breakfast and And, at social gatherings, ooh, what do you think? Who do you think is the murderer in the Hound of the Baskervilles or whatever?
What can fans expect next in any way of a sneak preview you might give us of what you're working on now?
Yeah, I am working on my next book right now, but I'm not talking about it publicly because I got kind of stung by Jack. After spending a long time working on something and then ditching it, I now realize that's a thing that can happen. So I don't talk about it in advance until I'm sure it's coming out.
It's really a full circle moment, isn't it? That you grew up reading science fiction authors, and today science fiction fans are reading you. That must trip you out sometimes.
Hell yeah, I love it. It is so awesome. It's like, it's literally my dream come true. Like when I was a teenager, I'm like, I want to be a sci-fi writer. I'm going to be a computer programmer because that's a realistic profession, but I can dream. And then it came true. So here I am. It's hard to describe. It's like, it's a frightening amount of responsibility that I have to now, do this for a living. I'm not just going to work and they'll pay me as long as I do my job. I'm like, I have to come up with a story and people have to like it and I have to do a good job on it. So that's scary, but it's also neat that I get to just use my imagination, come up with a story, and that's my job. And also, Jake, what's really awesome is just the huge piles of money I make. I can't say enough how awesome it is to just be shoveled money. I mean, I wish this could happen to everyone, although that'd probably be bad for the economy. But you know, it's awesome. And in the end, isn't wealth what it's really all about? No, I don't know. It is nice though that I can focus on my writing. I don't have to worry about finances. Um, and I've got a decent runway now. I can go years without any royalties at all and just living off my savings, which lets me really say like, okay, I'm never going to write a book just because I have to get a book out. I'll be like, if I don't like the idea I have, I'm going to wait till I come up with a good one.
Every author dreams of having the kind of global following that The Martian did. Has it been fun to go to different conventions, book signings, and events all over the world and see so many different translations of The Martian?
Now it's like second nature because Artemis and also Project Hail Mary, they're going all over the world. But at the time, I was so excited by it. I had a bookshelf where I just had one copy of every language of The Martian. It was awesome. I'm like, hey, everybody, I think you should all collect a copy of every language. If you don't have The Martian in Macedonian, are you really a fan?
You had a very unique entry into the bestseller author sphere. For aspiring writers, what kind of advice would you give them on how to carve out a niche to shine in whatever genre they write in?
In terms of pursuing it, I would remind people if you want to be a writer, writing doesn't actually have to be your profession. Like you can have your day, you can have your job and you can write. And those you don't have to be making your money off of writing. If you're passionate about it, if you want to do it, you can write in your own time. Now, that having been said, I do have some tips for. Well, actually, I want to go back to that. That's really important. A lot of people feel like I want to be a writer, and then they can't break into the industry, or they have a tough time, and they're like, "Oh well, I give up." I'm like, it doesn't have to be your profession. It can be your passion. And then maybe if you just keep at it, maybe like me, you get lucky and you break in eventually. Like I was a software engineer for 25 years before I broke into writing. And I broke into writing just by doing a labor of love and posting it to my website. I wasn't aggressively seeking out, a way in. Now, some tips for writing in general, I would say is number one, you have to write. This is the hardest thing. It's easy. You can do world building forever. It's lots of fun. World building, world building, world building. And you think like, oh man, it's going to be so awesome. This scene will happen. This scene will happen. I've got 9 more books planned for this series. And you do all that. But until you're actually putting words down onto paper or into your word processor, you're not writing, you're daydreaming. Sit down, write chapter 1 or just write page 1. And it sucks because people who are experienced at writing or attempting to write realize that as soon as they start writing, all the problems become apparent. You start writing and you're like, I've got all these cool ideas, but that's not happening right now. And it's like before the reader can even understand the plot, they need to know like 45 pages worth of expositional backstory. How the hell am I going to tell them that? And that's when the actual mechanical issues of your book start to come into play. It makes you start solving those problems, and they're not fun. They're not fun to solve, but that's what writing is. So that's number one. Number two, this is extremely difficult. This is the hardest thing in the world. Do not tell your friends and family the story. Resist the urge to tell them that story. Make a rule for yourself that says the only way anybody can encounter your story, to experience your story, is to read it. The problem is that most writers, not all, but most, myself included, are driven by a desire to have an audience. You want other people to experience the story that you came up with. When you tell it to people verbally, it scratches that itch, it satisfies that need, and it saps your will to actually write it. So don't tell it, which can be hard, especially if people are clearly interested in the premise. They're like, ooh, that does sound cool. Tell me more. It's really hard to say no to that because you want to tell the story and they want to hear it. But you got to resist that urge. Say like, all right, I'm going to write down a chapter and then I'll hand it to some friends if they want to read it. Now, the final thing I would say is there's never been a better time throughout all of history. Like seriously, from Gutenberg up till today, it's never been easier to self-publish. Because of the internet, anyone can self-publish. It costs you literally nothing. You don't have to put any money into it at all. You can just put your book up on Kindle or Barnes & Noble or any of a number of other e-publishers for free with zero outlay on your part. And the only thing you're risking is the time that you spent writing the book. And that's time you wanted to spend doing that anyway. So go for it. There's no longer an old boy network of publishers between you and the reader. Just do it. So that's my advice to anybody who's trying to break in. It's still not easy. You're not going to just magically acquire like millions of readers. But the barriers that previous generations have had are gone.
In closing, if you'd please give us and your fans just a little sneak peek into your daily writing routine as you're creating these other worlds on the page.
When I'm working on a first draft, I generally try to get 1,000 words a day written, or actually I set myself a goal of 5,000 words a week with a minimum of 1,000 words a day. So in other words, if I get a little bit ahead, it helps me on the following days. So that way I'm not encouraged to stop after I've written 1,000 words if I've got good flow going. And then, so that's what I try to do. And I set myself little rules of like, oh, I'm not allowed to watch any form of video entertainment until I've made my words for that day. No YouTube videos, no TV, no movies, no nothing. And there are certain websites, good time wasting sites that I enjoy, not allowed to do. My favorite hobby is woodworking. Not allowed to do that until I've made my words. Weekends I have off. That's when I'm working on a first draft. When I'm editing, everything's different. And editing is a lot easier for me. It's a lot easier to paint a house than it is to build it, you know. But as I'm sure you know, you've written a billion books. But my daily routine when I'm working on a first draft is generally I get up around 7. I just goof off, have coffee, snack, go to time wasting sites and stuff in the morning. I'll walk the dog. I come back. I generally I'll spend the morning answering work emails. I answer all of my fan mail, doing work-related stuff like answering online interviews and stuff like that. And then after lunch is usually when I start writing, and that's when I put myself in writing mode. I'm not allowed to do anything fun until I've made my words.
Andy, it's been an absolute blast talking to you today. I cannot thank you again for taking out time to be on About the Authors TV.
You too. Bye-bye.